Okay, so this is the last day where we are doing input talks in the questions fair, and we're about to head into the development constellation. YSI has, we're very proud of being such a diverse community and how we have members all over the world. And that I think is also one of the reasons that development as a theme is also something that has always mattered to YSI. You can see in the graph that there's already a lot of favorites and a lot of questions in the development constellation. We've been in the development constellation many times this week. This is the last session. This is the last chance to submit questions on development, at least during the duration of the plenary, to get the development questions up into the graph, and we are hoping for a lot of collaboration. Right now, we're still waiting to see if we can get Stephanie Blankenburg on the line. She's supposed to be the input talk for this speaker. She's supposed to be give the input talk for this session. We are ready though. I know Audra is sitting out in the development constellation, ready to discuss questions for development. We might have to do the sessions a little bit switched out while we're trying to get Stephanie on the line, but just because we don't have an input talk doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to think about the last questions. So, if you are in with us for the very first time and you haven't seen how the question fair work yet, we're coming together in YSI to define pertinent questions for our research community to work on, and I'm just going to cue a very short video as to how that works, and that's going to come here.
First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the questions fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find questions fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list.
Okay, we're back in the lighthouse, ready to beam out into the constellation. Audra is out there. This whole plenary has been a giant experiment. Like, we've never tried anything like the questions fair before. I doubt that anyone else has tried anything like the questions fair before. But these question sessions are actually a format that can run on their own. Just like if you go to the program and see the question submission sessions, we don't actually need an input talk, since the questions are questions for YSI, for the speaker to comment on, and not questions for the speaker. Maybe this specific session is going to take another format than what you're used to. We're going to start by just discussing questions without the speaker. If we manage to get Stephanie Blankenburg on the line, we will let Audra, the question manager, know, and we'll go over to the talk. But until then, I just want to hand it over to Audra.
Development. Get set for new developments. But in the room's an elephant. Do we need new development, or should we say to hell with it? Economies develop, blossom and expand. The nations in development copy those advanced. Advancement into what? How to understand if your manufactured goods are good goods or bad. Development implies undergoing change of state in the body or in general, or within the nation state. The body may develop into really great shape. It also may develop into being debilitated by disease. See, if our economy's advancement is subject to growth, then when's the growth of cancer? And how you know which is it? Can you tell before or after? I don't really know. That's for economists to answer. Development. Get set for new developments. But in the room's an elephant. Do we need new development, or should we say to hell with it?
Well, welcome to the question session. I actually think this is a great opportunity for us to get a head start on Stephanie's questions. So the purpose of the question session is to suggest new questions, like questions, and then we can talk about them and we can talk about rephrasings. But first, I would like to start by reading Stephanie's questions, and then we can kind of talk about them. So the first question that she submitted is, how can countervailing powers to the massive market and political power of TNCs be built in a hyper-globalized economy? You know what, let me go ahead and highlight that so you know we're talking. So you know, so you can kind of see there. And the next question that she submitted, how should credit creation be a public good? No, I'm sorry, should credit creation be a public good? If so, what does this mean for international monetary and financial relations? And finally, we have, what role can the United Nations system play to address major collective economic challenges? What needs to change? So we can also use this opportunity if you had any questions you would like to ask her or any questions you want to talk about with development, feel free to enter them in. And I think I actually saw a question come through, which was one that I was thinking about earlier, is how has COVID-19 exacerbated the debt crisis in developing countries? And, you know, we already had an emerging market debt crisis before this. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. I kind of think of what happened in Argentina over the summer with the restructuring of their debt. And I think that's a great question. And I'm actually going to take that and I'm going to put that in the graph right now.
Awesome. Sure. Audra, if I may, very interesting question. So I did ask this question about the exacerbation of debt, but now I'm distracted by Stephanie's question, especially the last one about the role of the United Nations. And so I think that is a great question. I think because she works for UNCTAD as well, it'll be so interesting when we get on the line to hear her opinion on it. But I was thinking about it earlier today about this growing sense or this lack of trust that I think that has been growing, and sort of a lack of trust towards institutions. And I think even to some extent, you know, thinking about when I was a child, I used to think that the UN was sort of like, you know, the holy grail of institutions, and especially, you know, international institutions. And as I've grown up, I've, you know, obviously began to see some of its shortcomings and its inability to, you know, make an impact or make a difference in certain instances. And also in some ways, the role that it plays in geopolitical power tensions as well, I think has left a lot to be desired. And so I think that is a really great question for us to discuss. You know, so how should the United Nations be repositioning itself? And I suppose not even just the United Nations, but thinking about the role of the WTO, the role of the World Health Organization. So there's all these international organizations, especially during COVID, whose role I'm thinking a lot about, and sort of trying to figure out, you know, where to go from here, and how do they play a role in a way that is productive and generative going forward. And so, yeah, that's me thinking out loud. I'm not sure what anyone else is thinking.
Well, I love that. Does anybody else have any other thoughts on that and the role that our institutions play, and especially with the pandemic and the debt crisis? And
hi, Audra, it's Jay here.
Hey.
I'm happy to be part of this pre-Stephanie talk now. For everybody that's dialing in and waiting for her, we are experiencing technical difficulties at UNCTAD, and she's having trouble dialing in, so just as an update. But as we're waiting, and Audra, thanks for starting the session, I do have a comment on one of the points that was raised. I believe it's question number 2 and 3 are actually related questions, in my opinion. Credit as a public, in public provision, if you will. What is the role of development banks? I think that's something that has been crowded out in the discussion for a long time over the past decades, and especially I think is, of course, the name already says it, a problem of development that UNCTAD concerns itself with, especially if I'm thinking about large-scale public investment that can actually transform developing economies out of a middle-income trap into advanced economies. I think that's a very big problem that we have to face. I don't think we have. We're also having Stephanie Griffith-Jones talk about this issue later today, so I'm going to let us look at how we can connect these two questions. But also, if you take it in the international sphere, what's been happening, I think that's to the third question. We have to be very wary, also learning from what we've heard from Perry Merling in the past, that the international system currently is a dollar system, a euro-dollar system that is offshore dollars, that a lot of the debt that is being issued in developing countries in particular is private, but private between non-US entities in Europe and private entities in the developing world. So if we, and I know UNCTAD is working right on this intersection of how the global South is engaging with this dollar system that is actually not managed within the US economy, but offshore in London for the most part. So that is also something we should watch out for as a major potential crisis emerging, partly because we're dealing with private debt that might have to be bailed out in some way by public institutions in the developed world. And also the issue that it's not federal, even if it's, especially if you're looking at Argentina, there's a lot of dollar accumulated debt, for example, at the subnational level as well. So there's a huge issue of debt that I know UNCTAD is working on. And the fact that we want to focus on how the international system is organized around money and debt and how it's currently oriented towards the US dollar is, I think, a huge issue that we have to fully comprehend if we want to also tackle all the questions around development, because of course it gives us the ability to create and develop our structures, but it comes with the cost that we have to also repay that debt in another currency that is not that of the country. And we're at the mercy of international markets to continue this debt creation and credit creation into that long-term horizon in which this development has to happen. So it's really important that we connect these two questions into a bigger conversation. I'm really looking forward to the presentation.
I couldn't agree more. Actually, one of my questions that I wanted to ask her prior to this had to do with the liquidity of private debt and what the socioeconomic consequences are of that private debt and the liquidity of it, and kind of back to Argentina. And I love it. I think that's a great point. I am going to go ahead and try to write that in and submit that question. Feel free, anybody else that has questions.
I mean, we can also directly connect it to what Martin Guzman will be talking about on Sunday in their closing. Martin Guzman, as you know, is the current economic minister of Argentina. And he, of course, is currently trying to manage a debt that is not sustainable within the country. And there are a number of issues that are related to this. Number one, how much debt there actually is, and when it becomes due. And part of what this negotiation has been that he's been engaged in was to rearrange the maturities of the debt that is coming due in order for Argentina to be able to cope, and also not just be to the service of its creditors, but also to be directly address all the social problems that are now requiring attention with COVID and already a very desperate population that is requiring, a lot of attention. And he's doing great work with that. And I think this issue is again endemic to the fact that we are dealing in developing countries with this very strong problem that you have debt issued in not your own currency. And when it becomes mature and how much it is are two important issues that we have to account for in this environment. Whenever there's a crisis, we see that, of course, the safe haven is, of course, US dollar markets or US dollar capital markets. That's what we saw in 2008. That's what we see in every crisis. And let's see what happens after the US election. I think there might be a better environment to re-engage the global South again. But it's a big problem to solve around this debt issue. And I know UNCTAD is working on that.
Yeah, that is a great point, and I am looking forward to his discussion on Sunday. So how would we formulate a question? I really like what you brought up about the dollar and harnessing the dollar. I don't know if anybody wants to give me a hand in formulating a question on that. Let's see.
Yeah, Audra, let's work on this together. So how about this? So the one thing we know that is required already from the UN agenda that she's raising in her third question is also something that Martin Guzman has been talking about at the United Nations too, which is that we need a framework, an international framework for resolving debt crises. So that is something very important. Currently there is none, and we can, part of the problem is that what we call sort of these, I think, forget the exact name, but there are these hedge funds that specifically buy distressed debt and then basically torpedo the debt, the negotiations. And there needs to be a framework that basically allows for countries to restructure their debt in an organized way. And the United Nations has been taking a leadership role in that. So I would really try to understand how we organize that appropriately, in the same way that bankruptcy is organized in every single market economy, we need that at the global scale. And can that happen at the United Nations? Is the United Nations the right place? So far, we've only seen that initiative within the UN General Assembly, nowhere else. And the second issue that's connected with that is how do we connect this issue to ensuring that when debt is taken on, that there is a way to ensure that this, for example, if it's dollar debt, we have to pay much closer attention to the fact that over the course of the maturity of this debt, you also need to generate dollars as the individual entity and as a country in order to repay that debt, or you will run into debt crises. And that's something that I think everybody knows, but we always end up in these cycles. And it even happens before we even run into problems because we're running on rollover debt that's short-term, and the short-term cycles can really turn into massive crises of confidence that turn into a lot of trouble for developing countries when these debts are in not your own currency. And that's actually been a hallmark of achievement of countries like Brazil, to be able to issue national debt in its own currency and have international investors trust that and invest in those types of capital markets and bond markets. That has been a hallmark of sort of development in some sense, at least when you think of financial markets. But I think the tensions all are right here. I think at this intercourse, how you interact with the dollar. And I think UNCTAD is taking the position in general to say, okay, this is inherently unfair that, some key currencies have all their savings, including the savings of developing countries, go into those capital markets in the US dollar or in the euro or whatever other key currency. And it's very tough and it exacerbates inequality. I know Gabriel Palmer is making important points here, that there's a lot of money leaving countries that is not actually staying within the countries, even that's what's being generated. So basically, just want to reiterate that there's a lot of tension in this immediate intersection of what is debt, what it means, these asymmetries between who's holding the debt and who's issuing the debt. I think it's super important to focus on these problems once again. And I'm just hearing, Audra, I think we have Stephanie Blankenburg.
Well, thank you guys so much. I feel like we have great questions and a great conversation started for her. This is an incredible opportunity.
But
remember to.
I will now basically, Audra, allow you to wrap this up in here quickly, and let me just quickly check with the studio if we're ready to take it over to her.
Okay, great. Well, Patrick, would you like to take this a little bit further before we go over to Stephanie?
Yes, I could. I was just typing like crazy. I keep my camera shut because the Wi-Fi here in the high-tech country Germany is not the best. What I mean by we could go a little bit further is that we should maybe not only think about, okay, how do we deal with debt, but how do we deal with that kind of like huge pile of public debt to occur in the first place. And I mean, trade imbalances play a huge role in here. So, maybe we should also think about how to design a system, and this, I think, could be done if central banks were to cooperate and kind of have a mechanism to adjust exchange rates based on different current account imbalances, which would obviously limit some of that kind of accumulation in the imbalances on the capital side if we were addressing that problem.
I think that's a great point. And I have just gotten word that Stephanie is ready for us. So we can go over to her whenever you are.
Excellent questions in the question sphere, and we are going to go live.
Sorry?
So I guess we are just starting.
Okay, my apologies again. Okay, so
that's all right. Now I'll just
pretty terrible picture, but there we go. in whatever quality I have. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. It seemed impossible to link, and I called, etc. But never mind. So okay.
We will start now.
Okay.
I'll just give a brief introduction about yourself, and then we make it happen. Thanks for making it in. It's an important topic, important day. We are already making it further and further. The YSI has advanced throughout this entire plenary such that we have many, many questions to discuss. And today's topic will be debt and development, more specifically, and perhaps explicitly credit creation. I'm Nurlan Jangeli. I'm one of the coordinators of the Economic Development Working Group. And today we have Dr. Stephanie Blankenburg, and she's the head of the Debt Development and Finance at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, so UNCTAD in short, a division on globalization and development strategies. Apparently, she also has her degree from Hamburg University, where I do study at the moment. And she specialized in growth theory and the role of institutions in growth. And recently she was more active in the field of credit creation. And today, I guess that will be one of her focus concerning the role of credit creation for the public purpose in the long term. And in general, like the section that she is leading within UNCTAD focuses on external debt sustainability and development, debt and debt sustainability, current challenges to developing country debt sustainability. And please welcome Stephanie Blankenburg.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here and to talk to young scholars in particular on issues that are very relevant and have been shown to be very relevant over the past few months when the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the global economy and has shown up a number of serious, entrenched, and systematic problems in the global economy that need addressing. I suppose that's to a considerable extent why I'm here. I did pose questions in the format that has been proposed, quite innovative and exciting format that has been posed by your forum to address. One was the question of the role of credit creation in the global economy, and the second was the question of the rise of corporate power and rentierist corporate strategies in the global economy and what to do about it, including also what the role of the United Nations, where I am obviously based, could possibly be in this. Now, I am currently placed at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where we look to a very large extent at imbalances, misalignments, and corresponding governance issues in the global economy through the lens primarily of what might be needed to promote catching up development. That's our job. That's our particular perspective. But that also leads us to obviously see quite clearly what are current problems in the international economy. And so let me start for this one with the first of the two issues I raised and mentioned, namely the role of credit in modern economies and the issues that have arisen due to what we would consider mismanagement of that role in both national as well as global economies. Now, as I'm sure you as young scholars will be aware, and as one very famous economist, obviously, John Maynard Keynes noted long ago, credit is the pavement along which production travels, and the bankers, if they knew their duty, would provide the transportation facilities to the extent that is required in order that the productive powers can be employed to full capacity. Now let that sink in. Credit is what keeps production going, and the creation, financial intermediation, we would say these days, of credit is the job of bankers that, if they knew their duty, would provide those transportation facilities to the extent that the productive powers of the entire community can be employed to full capacity. That, I think, is what one has to keep in mind to consider the importance of the role of credit creation, both in national economies as well as in the international economy. What we have seen happening in the global economy under the lead of major economies is, of course, what we generally refer to financialization. That is the combined deregulation or the deregulation of financial sectors and the rise of the size and importance of financial operations and interests in the global economy. Now, that to some extent has given rise to the precise opposite of what Keynes was hinting at, namely the need to to maintain a certain control of express collective interests over private interests. The exact opposite has happened in the belief that private interests can and should be the best way to promote global growth and development. Now, the subsequent rise of the financial industry and the subsequent rise of financial over real economy interests, in particular in leading industrial economies, what we often refer to as financialization, has many facets, but it really ultimately is about how can I put it most succinctly? It really is about the control or the application of public control to private interest of the public credit system. That matters. That matters mainly because the credit system is an instrument of control. It's an instrument of controlling not only the pace of global economic growth, but also its orientation to which purposes, for which particular goals. And what we have seen from this is that as credit creation has been de facto privatized, or at least the intermediation of credit creation has been privatized to a very large extent, and states have absconded from maintaining systematic overview over this, what we have seen are two things. One, in the first instance, credit creation, of course, proliferated because it was geared towards private interests and private profit making in the first place, resulting in a huge accumulation of debt in the global economy. Secondly, credit creation became, so to say, aimless. That is, it became delinked from public purposes. So any link that there would have been between granting credits, checking on creditworthiness, and checking on overall social purposes of credit creation were lost in the privatization of credit creation and the creation of financial innovations. While private banks and private financial institutions were sort of skilled in diversifying individual risks, they completely and utterly missed any kind of systemic risk that therefore arose for the global economy, as witnessed in the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. What we're now seeing again is another build-up of this kind of problem of a domination of private interests, diversified and non-coordinated private interests over the creation of means of payment, over the creation of credit, that is in modern economies, throughout the global economy. That's particularly virulent, of course, in advanced economies, but it does dominate the global economy, and it has led, in the context of, for other reasons, also slow global economic growth, slow build-up of global aggregate demand, to a reliance on access to this privatized, therefore unfettered, profit-oriented access to credit. So that's one aspect that I think needs to be discussed in this wider context of the role of credit creation and the role of money in modern market economies and in the global economy, since the counterpart, so to speak, over and above national levels of money creation is, of course, the international system of reserve currencies. That, of course, works very differently from the kind of money creation that happens at national levels, but and has its own problems. And is therefore so to speak, is therefore an issue that maybe we can discuss later in questions. But that means that international money, i.e. International reserve currency under this particular system, is by contrast to financialization at the national level and at the level of international financial markets rather restricted. We can talk about this later on, but that evidently causes a number of problems for in particular for developing countries and for the type of indebtedness and the dealing with their indebtedness that we can address. The second issue I wanted to point to is that in this, while we have seen that financialization, that privatization of money going on, we've also seen decades of a shift of power in the real economy, away from both national governments as well as smaller businesses to large transnational corporations. That that has been driven very largely by the same ideology that does see private interests govern public interests, and that has seen, in particular, market concentration become a major driver of income inequalities in the world. At UNCTAD, we have drawn up some data to just simply show that in a very large database for 56 developed and developing countries, looking at just the publicly listed firms in the world, for that sample, the profit incomes of the 2,000 highest earning transnational corporations account pretty much, or the change of this over time since 1995 accounts pretty much for the change that is the fall in the share of labor over that time, of labor income over that time. So what was earned in additional profit incomes over time since 1995 in the top 2,000 transnational companies is directly reflects what was lost to labor incomes in the global economy over that period of time in additional changes. That's pretty stark. It does show that what we have witnessed is a turn towards corporate power grab, so to speak, on the back of allowing market concentration to increase, but also on the back of that, allowing corporations to bolster their incomes, their profit incomes, largely through strategies that have allowed them to focus in on using their control of assets, their control of market power, rather than being obliged to engage with productive innovation, employment creation. That's what we refer to as corporate rentierism, and that has entailed a number of strategies, such as, say, for example, using intellectual property rights to bolster market power further, to prevent market access by new entrants, rather than using this for innovative purposes. It has entailed obviously powers to use not to use, but to undermine taxation systems in place, to engage very aggressively in tax avoidance, and in sometimes also tax evasion, but rather tax avoidance. It has entailed access to public subsidies, often without specific economic or social efficiency justification. It has entailed the ability to bolster and if you like, artificially increase shareholder value through financialized company management strategies, for example, through share buyback options and so on. So this has been a very core strategic feature of rising corporate power and associated deep income inequalities in the global economy. So if we take these two features together, on the one hand, the loss of public control over money creation, and on the other hand, the rise of corporate influence, power, market power, as well as political power through lobbying processes, we clearly do have a problem. And the question to pose is obviously, what can we do about this? How can we possibly rein in these two tendencies that, to my mind, are the most important tendencies? How can we do that? Since they feed into one another. So if we start thinking about this, and I'm happy, to have further discussions, what exactly that would entail. One question that I did raise, and that is of course close to our hearts here at the UN, is what can the UN precisely do about it? Is the UN still a place where these kinds of questions can be raised, where these kinds of questions can be addressed, and how so?
All right. So thanks a lot for your insights. While your talk was ongoing, we received also, there's like the other side of the this question fair where young scholars gather to develop some questions and formulate them related to the topic that you were talking. And now I will introduce you some of the questions that young scholars introduced or suggested on the platform that we have. And I would kindly ask if you can comment on this, just how to rephrase those questions or how you would like these questions to be better put for the research agenda in the upcoming years. The first one is that how has COVID-19 exacerbated the debt crisis in developing countries?
Okay, well, in so many ways. I mean, from what I was saying previously and based on the questions I had submitted, we are looking at an international monetary system that is in pretty dire straits, and that has led to a large build of debt obligations in developing countries, right? In developing countries who are obliged to contract debt in the international financial markets, often at with high risk profiles attached to them, that are unprotected against capital flow volatility, that are unprotected against high risk profiles of becoming indebted in the global economy. Now, COVID-19 has exacerbated this for developing countries in a number of ways. First of all, the reversal of capital flows, private capital flows, given the large exposure of developing countries to having to rely on private finance rather than on public finance, that outflow has been unprecedented. In the first 3 months of the COVID-19 crisis, the capital outflows from developing countries, according to the data we rely on, went up to about just above 100 billion US dollars as compared to 33 billion following the global financial crisis of 2008. So you get a sense of how extraordinary that reversal of capital flows into developing countries was. Obviously, squeezing their fiscal spaces and their ability to access international financial markets in the future. Secondly, of course, trade, international trade, that apart from generating income generally for developing countries, also allows them to earn US dollars so that they can pay their debt obligations, has shrunk by a reported figures differ between the World Bank and other institutions, but roughly about 17 to 80%. Just between May 2019 and May 2020. So we already have that collapse. Importantly for developing countries already, of course, remittances have also gone back very considerably, reportedly around 20% in this year. And FDI flows, foreign direct investment flows, have been sort of reported, estimated, again by UNCTAD itself to be contracting around 40%. Now, if we take this together, this creates impossible balance of payment constraints on developing countries, while at the same time, which is what we have been saying for some time, while at the same time, there's no coordination in the international community to provide the kind of liquidity, to not even talk about debt relief, etc., which could contribute to this, but to send in the kind of unconditional liquidity that would be needed immediately. That has just not happened. Those were discussions around special drawing rights. Those were discussions around ongoing discussions about debt relief. And many of you may have heard of the G20 debt suspension debt service suspension initiative, DSSI, that continues to be discussed. But this is if this is the height of the international community's response to the plight of developing countries, and in particular low and middle income developing countries at this time, it isn't even a drop in the ocean, right, by anybody's standards. So COVID-19 has certainly done havoc to developing countries' external imbalances and therefore fiscal spaces. But response coming forward by the international community is lacking, reflecting the 2 points I've raised previously.
All right. Yeah, I think like you've got there pretty valid points concerning the way the COVID-19 impacted the developing countries, especially in terms of the outflow of the capitals and many investments into the countries. And now we've got 2 more questions and we have 5 minutes remaining. And now perhaps what we could do best is that I will introduce the question and you can just comment on it, and we are not seeking here for an answer. And the most important thing is that like you can just maybe comment on the question, that how people should work on a relevant question, or what type of question should be formulated by young scholars, because this question will be one of the backbone for future projects of YSI. And the second question reads like this: what are the social consequences of private debt in emerging economies? How do we protect them from the liquidity of corporate private debt? And now you can comment on this and for 2 minutes, and then we can move perhaps possibly to the next one and then finalize this talk.
To some extent, it depends on what private debt we're talking about, whether it's household debt or corporate debt. But assuming that in emerging economies, much of this is corporate private debt, there's not very much you can do, so long as private debt has been hedged by the private companies that have taken on with that debt through corresponding, in particular in foreign denominated currency, through foreign denominated assets, that might be more or less fine. But overall, there are clear concerns, though differing across developing countries, as to what the spillover effect of mounting private debt might be through much of this coming onto public balance sheets. Now, what can we do about this is something that needs to be seen, but it's not something that can be solved at the level of national governments. It's something that will need to be solved and addressed in terms of regulations and policies about capital controls, and about the submission of developing country policy regimes to wider policy regimes at the global level that I've mentioned, that are focused more towards the creation of profits for from private credit intermediation than they are towards governing debt flows between nations for wider collective purposes.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a definitely valid point, that how the general governance of the international monetary functions could happen to tackle this problem. And perhaps that could be in the rephrasing of the question, because young scholars, after we are done with this speech, they will start rephrasing their questions. And I will introduce you the last question that we are given, and you can comment on this as well and criticize or just tell your opinions. And the question reads as such: how do we advance more equitable, less costly sovereign debt restructurings? Is debt relief an option? What do you think about this question?
Sure, that's to be an option. It absolutely has to be an option. in that the way developing countries have accumulated external sovereign debt, in particular, over the past years, has to do with the particular features I pointed out in response to the questions I myself put in. So the driver of that debt has been the often premature integration of developing countries in international financial markets. So much of this, while debt per se is not the problem, developing countries do need to be able to take out, to indebt themselves in the international economy at reasonable terms. That has not been the case because of these two trends that I pointed out very largely in recent decades. Now, as far as sovereign debt restructuring is concerned, of course, this also has been what we have witnessed very largely is a very creditor-biased international system. We can see this even in the most recent G20 common framework that has come out or is about to come out on debt treatments that looks at developing country debt sustainability still in terms of how the short-term repayability, the maximum short-term repayability of debt to creditors can be achieved. That's the perspective. And the shared G20, largely shared G20 perspective, one should say. Now, that obviously has to change, and it can. It can. There are multiple proposals, but it will require at this stage, and given the extent to which debts are accumulating in developing countries, it will require a very concerted international effort, including an institutional effort, to build an institution that can look at what debt sustainability in developing country means, B, on how negotiations about restructuring should be conducted. That's very much required, and that can be done.
All right, thanks a lot. I hope, I think like that's also a valid concern, that how these proposals will be about the restructurings of not only for a country, but the international level, that how the governance of debt restructuring happens throughout the world, especially in terms of international monetary structures. And hopefully young scholars on the other side of the plenary got a lot of insights from your inputs. And now I think we are heading back to the question moderation again.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephanie, for doing such a great job despite the technical difficulties in the beginning. We had an amazing talk, a lot of input for the people in the questions fair. Remember that the session is not over. First, we're going to go back to the questions moderation part, where we're going to discuss all these questions that were submitted to Stephanie. And since we don't have so much time, we're going to head right over there.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. We received a lot of interesting questions, and she commented on our top 3. However, even good questions can be improved by being more precisely, adequately, or inspiringly formulated, and that is our task for this part of the session. The point is to work collaboratively on alternative phrasings and to improve them as research questions before they join the guiding stars in our development constellation. So I encourage everybody to ask your questions. You can raise your hand in the chat by going to the participants, or put your question in the chat, and I look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to go ahead and start, probably going one by one will probably be the easiest. So we could probably start with the first question. How has COVID-19 exacerbated the debt crisis in developing countries?
Hey, Audra, it's Jay again.
Hey.
It's actually quite interesting because both Perry and Zoltan and others have been talking about this in the other meetings. I didn't take part, but I heard back. it's quite interesting because the initial reaction, of course, is that the initial shock of the COVID-19 crisis was that there was a massive sell-off on the capital markets. And so what we expected in the developing countries was a liquidity crunch. However, something interesting happened that Perry points out, and that is that in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, there were emergency liquidity lines, which means that the Federal Reserve had given permission to some central banks to swap basically unlimited amounts of dollars to those countries, in particular, Bank of England, to the euro and a number of other countries. And that framework was made permanent. It was made from an emergency measure into a permanent measure. And that has now been extended to 17 or so countries, if I'm not mistaken. And this system actually held up right now to basically get dollars to certain countries that had a liquidity crunch to resolve the immediate problem of liquidity in the initial shock. So that's an interesting development, and I think something that deserves more attention as well. And maybe that's a question I should have maybe asked directly to Stephanie, because I'm really curious what they think about that international arrangement. I think it's Perry actually points out that this is a massive institutional shift from what we've had, but we are more focused on solvency rather than liquidity issues. But the question here that we're looking at right now is that, of course, when economies are being hit by this, by the inability to generate dollars and the economic slowdown hits, that, of course, hits emerging markets, especially the private debt that she was alluding to, and their ability to generate dollars through exports if there's a slowdown. So I think this is going to be a massive problem going forward, because these dollar debts stay denominated in the same way, even though the cash flows in dollars are decreasing across the board. And that's why I think it's a connected issue. I think it's going to make this problem even bigger going forward, and we need to have this connects to the various issues of how do we restructure debt, because it was nobody's fault that this pandemic hit. Yet some countries will have to fully pay the debt and adjust, whereas the creditors can claim, hey, I'm owed this no matter what. And so that's, I think, the asymmetry that she was also alluding to. So this is just something I want to connect to some other sessions that have happened.
Well, I thought that actually beautifully connected all of the questions that we talked about today. I don't know if anybody has any ideas for rephrasing, but I think Jay beautifully tied in the how do we advance more less costly debt restructurings, and debt relief has to be an option. As Stephanie said, it obviously is an option. So maybe we could reformulate that. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts, but maybe answering the debt relief as an option. And I really also like how you tied in the private debt in emerging markets and how do we protect them from the liquidity. I think that's a great development that I didn't even know about.
I mean, that issue is really, really problematic right now. Anybody that's following the news right now knows that there is a real problem of searching for yields. And of course, there's a lot of money flowing to places where there's a slightly higher return on investment, but that's money that's moving around fast. And that's exactly what Stephanie was also pointing to. What these countries need for development is a long-term financing horizon. That's why development banks and public investment is critical to underpin any private investment. And I think without any clear structure, I think the system will always keep breaking. I think we have to eventually rely on a more resilient financial market within a country, rather than having it completely tied to international flows that move around on a moment's notice. And that's kind of an issue that I'm quite interested in myself. How does development work? And there are structures that we need that tie long-term planning horizons, like what also Mariana Mazzucato is saying, but with the fact that where do we generate the capital required to make these promises happen? And the biggest problem here, again, is that most developing countries don't seem to be able to borrow within their own currency. And one issue is that leads to long-term debt issues and build-ups. The second issue is that we have private debt build-ups because it's convenient now. The corporate sectors are building up because the money is just there and it's conveniently available. But when the crisis hits and investors leave, you still have to, as a country, find a way to generate dollars, and that then spills immediately into how you as a country generate enough dollars to repay the debt that's coming due. And that's the classic story. We all know this of debt crisis turned into currency crisis, turned into massive societal problems. And we just have to break that cycle somehow. We have to somehow share the burden through a variety of measures. And one thing that is quite clear is that capital controls, not letting money enter and leave so quickly, but also making sure that the cost of any restructuring is shared by the creditor and debtor equally. So I think, let me just get into that right now to start a rephrasing of the question to sort of say, how do we think about this in a more long-term structure? Because that's, I think, a critical issue.
Great. And if anybody else has any ideas and how we can rephrase this and maybe incorporate the capital controls and address the reverse of the capital flows in the first or any of the questions, feel free. But while Jay is working on a rephrasing, I will read the next question. And but feel free to unmute yourself and jump in whenever you want to do this or whenever you have something to say. But our next question that Stephanie talked about was, how do we advance more equitable and less costly sovereign debt restructurings? Is debt relief an option? I'm going to take a second and work on a rephrasing for this one. So bear with me. Let me go ahead and add that there. Okay, so I kind of rephrased it a little bit more based on Stephanie's feedback, is how could financial systems, kind of focusing more there, be modified to help achieve the needs of a more sustainable and inclusive economies? So in that question, we kind of maybe assume or imply that debt relief is an option. Oh, sorry. Oh. Here we go. But I will move on to the next question. Jump in if you have any comments. What are the social consequences? Oh, let me highlight this for you guys. And me too. What are the social consequences of private debt in emerging economies? How do we protect them from the liquidity of corporate private debt? So Stephanie started with kind of a bleak response to that, and that there's nothing that national governments can do. Sorry, let me check and see if anybody's raised their hand. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, Audra.
No, please.
Yeah, so I was just wondering that this question is a little bit more a generalized version. I think, like, by the term, the social consequences. So I think that term need to be more clearly defined, because there are several social issues and each social issue has its own consequences. So if we can rephrase it more in terms of a particular by redefining the social consequence thing a bit more. So that's just what I wanted to comment. Thank you.
No, that's fantastic input. I love it. Why don't we take a second and maybe we can all think about how we can incorporate that, and then we'll put the rephrasings and we'll find our favorites. That was a fantastic comment, and I couldn't agree more. We definitely can make this more specific. Oh. Sorry, I clearly need a little eye assistance, so it's taking me a minute. Oh, I don't know that I did the best here. I'm gonna suggest a rephrasing, but I hope you guys have better than I did. So I tried to make it more specific with your input because I really appreciated that. So now the target of the question is, what groups are most affected by the increased debt from emerging economies, and how do we protect them? The ones most affected, I should probably said negatively affected. If anybody wants,
kind of adversely affected.
Adversely affected. Ooh, if anybody wants to jump in and submit that, please, I will transfer my heart immediately. But
and maybe just even to make it more specific, because we are, if I understand you correctly, Yilum, is that how you pronounce your name? We are talking about specific groups within the country of the corporation which is taking on foreign denominated debt, correct? So we're talking about, so we have to look at the dynamics within a country that is as a nation interacting. So there's certain groups, if I understand it correctly, like the corporate sector, and certain people are interacting with the international debt markets, but they're not the only ones paying the price. And that's actually connecting they're actually mostly not paying the price, because a debt crisis, a currency crisis, affects the population more so than the corporate sector.
Yeah, and on that point, they're usually not the winners either.
Ooh, and this makes me think of another thing right now that's coming up on Monday, I believe. There's Jacob Fagan has just come out with a report, and he's speaking at the Financial Stability Group. For those who are interested, this point speaks to the class structure of the global dollar system, and he's basically making an argument that speaks exactly to your question, and that goes to the fact that there's a certain class of people within most developing countries that are connected to the international dollar system through either being bankers or being in the corporate sector, and they basically have built a class around this. The fact that they are connected internationally inside that international system, whereas the rest of the country is not benefiting at all from this access. And there's a power structure associated with this class that is intermediating the international to the domestic. And I think maybe do you have any intuition if that's true in your own country? We should probably check out his webinar on Monday with the Financial Stability Group, because I think it's a very powerful argument, if that's the case.
It's really a very powerful argument. And so far in my view, so I don't think that, the big corporations like the agents who are actually, connecting with the international agencies regarding this kind of problem, they are like disregarding the major section of the population who are actually getting affected from this debt crisis. So this ever increasing debt, they are like every other economic phenomenon, affecting the marginalized sections of the society. So in that way, I think a more localized authoritarian actions should be taken into account. And the international agencies, their role should be aligning with the local authoritarians, so as to see that how the indirect effect of such debt is actually magnifying, like in countries like India, I must say, like the country where I'm living, to be honest. For example, like the crisis that we are currently in, I'm not saying it because this is one of the most discussing issue now, but needlessly, India is one of the most affected countries in terms of economic crisis by the COVID, and the effect is most devastating of the people belonging to the lower sections in terms of the income. Like a majority part of our country is in the informal sector, to be honest. But the one who is or who are connecting with the international agencies and also like to the developed nations in terms of corporations are the top 1% population who are the big corporations. For example, Reliance and some of the government agencies as well. So they while they are reporting the issues that the macroeconomy as a whole is facing, but the social issues are disregarded. The ever increasing debt, it has its social consequences in terms of emphasizing the inequality and all sort of stuff. I think more importance should be given on this kind of indirect consequences of ever increasing debt. So that's just one of the point I'd like to add. Actually, I joined the session a bit late because of some I was in another meeting a bit ago. So I hope I'm clear with my point. Maybe you can rephrase it.
I love it, and I'm so glad that you came to join our session. And I feel like your input has been so valuable. I am similar to that, running a little over time. So we will have to cut this, but we do have question submission sessions. Please come to them, and then we can talk about and add more questions to them. But on that note, you will notice now that there's a star next to your questions. Feel free to add your favorites. You'll have 10 throughout the conference. If you haven't given out all your favorites, go into the different constellations and put your stars there. But while we work on that, I should probably hand it back over to Thomas in the studio, and my apologies for running over, but I think it was worth it.
Hey, welcome back. Now we're zooming out from the development constellation and going back to see
and Thomas
the entire
is on.
graph and how it has developed based on these new questions that are now to be found inside of the development constellation over here. And we're going to be a little bit quicker than usual, so just let's dive right into the development constellation. Yeah, now we can see, if you can go out to the development constellation, then we can see all the questions. So now we're seeing the session. There we go. We are now in the development constellation. And Here we can see that what are the top favorited questions in this constellation that you can see here. You saw the entire constellation go away, and you can only see the ones that had lines between them are the ones that are part of the top 100. The blue ones are the research interest that gives the gravity to the entire graph, and the ones you see here are the top favorited questions in the constellation. Up here we have how can we frame a model of development that is more people-oriented rather than goods-oriented. It has 7 favorites. Is industrialization a necessary step for economic development? Has been in the top for a while. And then Jayati Ghosh's question, how can economics address issues of intersecting inequalities such as class, gender, race, caste, ethnicity, local migrant? If you want to have a say on which should be the most favorited questions, well, make sure to make it into the questions graph, browse around the different constellations, mark the ones you think are favorite. We don't have many minutes left because before we have to step over to Stephanie Griffith-Jones. So I'm just going to stop here and I'll see you in a few minutes.